The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
Okay, welcome everybody to Current Topics. We are going to today we're going to continue our discussion on experimental research. So we're going to give you another tool for your toolbox, or a set of tools that explains how people conduct research in human-computer interaction. And it is a little bit different from what you're used to in other fields of computer science, probably, if you've looked at research in computer science in other areas. So that's why this is an important part. And once we're done with this, the second part of today's class will then be about, once I've found something interesting that I think is a new scientific discovery or new scientific knowledge that I want to share, how do I publish that? How does that work? How does that whole process actually function? So that's what's on the plate today. Now, we're going to focus on a kind of study and experiment that is quite common in HCI. And that is the one that takes a hypothesis and turns it into an actual controlled experiment. And last lecture, we talked about some of these things already. We talked about between groups designs, within groups designs, etc. We covered counterbalancing, we covered the Latin square technique, and we talked about scales, right? These are things that we've already talked about. So we're going to continue this today and go into some more of these aspects. So this graph, just to explain, this is basically the sort of like a blueprint for a typical controlled study where you have independent and dependent variables. You're manipulating them, and you are measuring ultimately what happens then on each of these sides, and then you compare them. The comparison will come later. That's when we get into statistics, when we try to find out, did we actually discover something interesting or not? For now, it's about how you run this experiment and how you make sure that the data that you collect is actually correct in a variety of ways. You know, that it is valid, that there are no confounding variables changing it around. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Once we've covered these all these things, you will have sort of a model for how actually controlled experiments in HCI and other disciplines work. So this is also applicable to any other scientific field that actually conducts controlled experiment measurement experiments. So psychology, biology, chemistry, physics, all these fields of natural sciences, even also sociology, all these fields have the same fundamental apparatus of how they do research. That's why also some of the related work that we point you to, some of the texts that we point you to, are not from an HCI background, but are maybe from a psychology, or maybe even from a medical background. Even medical studies have the same challenges, the same fundamental principle. It's the fundamental scientific principle of running a controlled experiment. So we're going to take a look at the variables, how you measure them and how you control them. So that's going to be our focus for the next couple of days. Now, variables, there's a couple different kinds of variables. We know that there are independent variables. Those are the ones, the name is confusing, right? Don't get confused by this. The name independent doesn't mean that it changes by itself. In fact, the independent variable is the one that you, as the researcher, actually manipulate, that you change consciously. Like it could be two different conditions that you are testing in your experiment, right? The dependent variables are the ones that you measure, that you observe, that you take a look at. And so they are dependent, at least that's what you think you are showing, they're dependent on the independent variables, okay? So those names are a little bit confusing. Make sure you don't mix those up. So we try to observe the dependent variables, and we are looking for effects that the independent variable changes that we do by manipulation have on the dependent ones. All other variables, apart from the independent ones, those two are the core of your experimental design. Everybody will tell you in their experimental design what the independent variables were. You'll find that in the papers that we take a look at. All the other variables we call extraneous. And among these extraneous variables are some that can be dangerous to the validity of our experiment. And those are confounding variables. A confounding variable is one that we haven't included in our independent or dependent variables, but it actually does change systematically along with our existing independent and dependent variables, or IVs and DVs. Why is this a problem? Well, if it changes systematically, that suggests that there may be an alternative explanation of the relationship between independent and dependent variables. You know, we're trying to nail everything down and then wiggle one end of our system, right, an independent variable, and hope that, you know, as a result, something moves over here in the dependent variables. But if there's something else that also moves along with these, then maybe that could be the cause for the changes we're seeing in both the independent and dependent variable. There's a variety of different other explanations that could be possible if we find one such confounding variable. Now, how do we deal with extraneous variables in general, the confounding ones and the other ones? Variables that are often, not always, but often extraneous to our experiments in HCI specifically are things like age or level of expertise, right? We often just, you know, collect a bunch of users and we assume that the age of the users oftentimes is not something we want to explicitly control, right? You may run a study where you say, I'm going to test this with people in different age brackets, but if you don't, if you just pick a bunch of users and you don't care about their age, you may record the age just for the sake of completeness to have it documented. And that's a good idea, but you may not assume that it is a factor in how your dependent variables change. And so what we can do to deal with these kinds of variables, there's a bunch of different approaches. The first one, and that's almost like the most obvious one, is you say, well, let's see here. I'm not sure whether age is going to, you know, have an influence on the performance in this experiment that I'm doing. I'm really interested whether, you know, my pi menu or linear menu, to pick, you know, our standard example, whether that's, you know, which one is faster of them. That's what I want to find out, right? Which one's faster? But maybe age has an influence, has an effect. I don't know. So I can just hold age constant, right? I pick all the participants to have the same age, right? And then I know that age differences can't have an influence on my performance because there are no age differences. Problem with that, of course, is that now I have only measured it for people of, say, the age of 25, right? So I have shown something, but I've really only shown it for a population of a certain age. But for that population, I have demonstrated the effect. Another thing you can do is, let's say you can't get everybody to be of the same age, which is actually, you know, pretty hard to do. You may say, I'm going to actually split up my group of participants, and I'm going to match participants into different bins. Like I'm going to say, I'm going to have an age group 20 to 30, I'm going to have an age group 30 to 50, and I'm going to have an age group 50 to 80 or something. And then I'm going to test things separately, and I'm going to record and look if there is any effect. What you've done now is actually you've turned your extraneous variable age into effectively an independent variable, right? You are now controlling, manipulating it, you know, consciously, which is also okay, right? It does mean, however, that you're ending up with more different experimental variations, and your experiment is going to take longer, or you're going to need more users, right? That's a problem. Next up, what can you do? You could also say, well, you know, I have so many users of a variety of age groups. I'm just going to mix and match. I'm just going to mix them around. I'm just going to randomly assign participants to each value of that extraneous variable, right? That's another solution you could pick, where you basically say, I just have a distribution of ages in there, and I'm not going to pay attention to who goes where. If you have enough users, this may balance things out, right? But with a small number of users, this is tricky. Okay, so that's how we fundamentally deal with these extraneous variables, which we have down here, some of which may be confounding variables, which we don't want, right? We don't want confounding variables. They are a problem, right? That's the typical thing, you do your research, you write your paper, you try to publish it, you send it in, and a reviewer says, I think there's a confounding variable X in your experiment. And then it's, you need to explain why you don't think that's the case. Next up, we're going to take a look at validity. Validity means, is your experiment valid? Is the results that you report, are they actually founded on a valid experiment that you've run? Or have you made a mistake, a methodological mistake in your experiment that means that the data that you collected can actually not be trusted? So validity is super important in your experimental design. And there's two kinds of validity that I want to explain: internal and external validity. Internal validity means that the study that you ran produces a single unambiguous explanation for the relationship between your, let's take a simple example, one independent variable and a dependent variable, right? So you've got your pi menu versus linear menu. The type of menu is your independent variable, and you've got the performance time to select, an item, the correct item out of 10 items, and you do that a bunch of times and you measure the time. So you got an average performance time for the task, and that's your dependent variable. And your study is internally valid if, looking at your study design, everybody agrees there's only one explanation for what's going on here, and that is that pi menus are faster to select things from than linear menus. Right? So age or other factors, or the time of day, or whatever, or other differences in your user base, in your participant group, are not an influence. So there are threats that can happen, like confounding variables influencing your, breaking your internal validity, which I just gave you an example of. But you could also have an experimenter bias, right? You could also have designed the experiment in a way that actually favors one condition over the other, and that would be a typical bias by the experimenter. You could have learning effects in there where people, do later rounds of the experiment more quickly than earlier rounds because they've learned how to use the system in general. And we've talked about how you can avoid learning effects. You may also see what's known as the Hawthorne Effect, which is that oftentimes even just being observed causes changes, right? So in a study, in an experiment, if you find that that you observe something like a user doing a task, and just the fact that you observe it actually changes the results, that's also something that you need to be on the lookout for. So this is all internal validity. Now, what's external validity? External validity means, can I take the findings that you report in your research and apply it to a larger population or larger context, right? So for example, if you run your study only with fellow computer science students of the age 20 to 28 or something, then you have shown something for that population, but can we generalize those results to, let's say, a population of people who work in a factory and are between 40 and 55? Right? Is that okay? Sometimes you can argue why your data will be able to generalize to other contexts like this or other user groups. Sometimes it's hard, right? So at least it needs to be paid attention to. And the dangers there are that you may be generalizing too much, right? So oftentimes people show something under very specific settings and then make very broad sweeping claims what they've shown. That's known as overclaiming, right? Overclaiming your results. So you showed something very specific and you make a much more general claim on what you think you showed. And that's a danger, that's a threat on your external validity. Another thing that you may also find is that you may have multiple independent variables in your experiment. So not just one, not just, let's say, pi menu versus linear menu, but maybe the second factor is also the number of menu items in your menu, let's say, right? So you run the study and you claim, oh, pi menus are faster than linear menus. But if you look closely, you actually find that there is something going on, an interaction between the type of menu and the number of menu items, and that maybe pi menus are only faster than linear menus for menus up to the length of 5, and for menus with more than 5 entries, linear menus end up being the better choice. Right? So those kinds of things are another threat on your external validity. In the end, you will often find that the study design, you cannot optimize and perfectly reach internal and external validity. It's not possible, because if you wanted to show something for every person on the planet, without any doubt, you would have to kind of test it with every person on the planet. So that's not possible. But even just getting all kinds of different age groups, for example, demographics in there, even just the mix of your participants will always be a challenge to cover the broadest possible user base. And if you're smart, you formulate your claims in the end only based on what you actually found with your user base, right? At the same time, you could say, well, a typical example of external versus internal is lab versus field study. You can run a study in a lab, super controlled. You keep everything under control, no disturbances, and the user has to, use these pi and linear menus all the time and test with them. You will get high internal validity from such a study, right? Very few confounding variables. Nobody comes into the office when you do this in your lab with a study, when you have people come into your lab, nobody interrupts them, no phone calls, nothing like that. But it means also that you, in the end, only can talk about a result that is true when somebody is in such an undisturbed situation. If you go and say, well, so I've shown that, this interaction, the pi menu is faster than linear menu, and that's generally true, people might say, well, are we sure that that's also true when people are in a real world, busy office setting where they're getting disturbed all the time and calls come in and they've got, other displays around them or stuff hanging on the wall that they look at to glance information from. So if all these other factors are there, is your data still true? And oftentimes you'll have to say, well, not quite sure here, right? So the more you nail down all your external influences, the more you exclude these external influences, the higher your internal validity, but it lowers your external validity, right? That's sort of a trade-off that you always often have to make based on what you really want to show. Now, I said earlier that one of the ways to deal with extraneous variables is to just, change them in a controlled way, which means you make them an independent variable, right? And I also mentioned that can lead to the problem that you end up with too many experimental conditions, right? That's one challenge. The other challenge is if you leave them as random, it may reflect the variation in natural use, which raises your external validity, but it brings down your internal validity, right? Because you no longer have that clean-cut, super controlled situation. If, on the other hand, you control all your extraneous variables, like interruptions during a task or phone calls coming in, then you get your internal validity going up, and you get higher confidence that you can actually derive causality from your results. So you can show everything else has stayed perfectly the same between these two conditions, right? No interruptions, no extraneous variables, no confounding variables. So I know that the menu type must have been the reason why performance changed between the one and the other condition, right? That's great. So high confidence to infer actual causality from the results. But it means that your external validity goes down, as I just explained. So this is often the conflict that you're looking at. Now, that means we've now sort of covered these various, these are really more talking points, right, in this graph. That's what this really is. We will get into the question of how exactly to compare variables, because you can see this doesn't have a little check mark yet. Comparing variables means that you run statistical tests. That's something that we'll talk about in the upcoming statistics lecture. Okay, so that's next week. Now, this concludes, in a way, our discussion of how, for now at least, we conduct research, and we're going to now move to the next phase of the academic process, and that is publishing your Hci research. Remember that we had this messy truth picture where you have your observations and or a related scientific theory, and you build a couple of prototypes, then you run a real-world study with them. You get maybe a descriptive model out of that for the performance that users have with it. You build some more prototypes. You run maybe a long-term effect study, and you may even end up with a predictive model that can predict how people behave. This is, often we said that this is often the truth of how research happens, right? For example, we've built a lot of mobile interface techniques that we think, that were new. For example, using input on the back of your smartphone, right, to type with, right? So because when you hold your phone in this configuration, you're actually it's easy to type here on the back. So we tested this. We found, in the beginning it was actually kind of slow, but then we ran, that was our real world study, and then we built some, we changed our prototypes some more, and we actually ran a longer study where the authors used this for a longer time themselves, and they actually got really fast with it. So sometimes you have to do these different studies to find where the value in a new technology actually lies. So this is, I want to now give you the sort of the full picture. This is sort of probably the most zoomed out slide of all of current topics. The full picture on Hci research, right? What you've just seen, this whole process of prototyping and running studies and evaluating results, is what your own studies are about, right? And this is now sort of, imagine that's what this microscope is about, right? That's you doing your research. You do this research, of course, by pulling in related work, right? You read on what other people have done in the field, because you don't want to just repeat somebody else's study and get the same results. That's usually not super exciting. Sometimes it's important to replicate results, but generally you want to build on what people already know and find something else, right, on top of that. And so that's all conducting Hci research, right? That's what we've talked about so far. So last week's were about that, right? We talked about the different kinds of contribution types. We talked about how you read scientific papers and contribution benefit statement. And we've talked a lot about the research approaches and how you build empirical studies in particular, because they're pretty common in Hci. Now, let's say you found something cool, right? Let's say you discovered something interesting. You want to let other people know about it, right? And that's the whole process that we're going to talk about for the rest of today. And that is the process where you have to write up your results, your research, and then it usually in academia goes to what's known as a peer review. A peer is just a colleague or another researcher who is in the same field as you, at usually a different university or institution, and they actually take a look at your work. They read your paper that you send to them for review, and then they will write an honest review whether they think that, for example, your studies were done correctly, or whether your findings are relevant to the community, or whether you have not overlooked any work that others have already done. So they do the best that they can, usually in a volunteering capacity, so they don't get paid for this. This is just something academics do. I do this all the time as part of my job. I review work from people around the world, right, who've done stuff that I know something about, and I give that paper my honest opinion. And if the reviewers, typically it's more than one person, all agree that this work is outstanding enough and important enough, then it gets published. And typically, those review cycles happen around things like conferences or journals of particular kinds. So that's the whole publishing Hci research process, right? That you have probably, unless you were really lucky and did in your bachelor thesis already some work where you could contribute to a paper, you've probably not seen this part. So we want to tell you about this. And once the publication is out, it actually becomes another part of this body of knowledge, right? It becomes this one extra page in this one extra book, basically, that then other researchers will be able to read about and discuss, and most importantly, build their own work on top of. And that's what we're going to talk about today, right? So criteria for what actually does make a good paper. We will walk through a sample paper, and I will show you where the different quality aspects of the paper are hiding and how you can see them and identify them. And I'll also give you an overview of how this peer review process actually works, like what actually happens when a paper that gets sent to the CHI conference, for example, because that's a conference we know really well, and it's also the top conference in the world on Hci research. So what happens when people send a paper to this, to CHI for getting reviewed and possibly published? This isn't easy, by the way, and in the case of CHI, lots of people send their best work there every year, and only 1/4 of all the papers that are sent there even gets accepted, right? So only the top quarter of the papers that get sent in actually makes it into publication. 3/4 get rejected. So you can see it's quite a tough filter to make it through there, but that's what makes it a quality publication, right? In the end, when you see something got published at CHI, it's gone through a pretty intense peer review process. So that means when you find a paper published at that conference, for example, you can trust the results quite well, right? That could be different when you see another paper published at a different conference that has much more lax standards on how it reviews its submissions. And that's something you will find out as you enter a field and you read about the conferences, you understand their acceptance rates, for example, you see the kind of impact that papers from these conferences have over the years because other people are citing them as related work. So over time, you develop your own sense of this landscape of different conferences, journals, standard textbooks in a field like Hci, and that means you are becoming part of this research community. And I also just need to get on my soapbox here real quick and get rid of a little rant, because I hopefully have your attention. A lot of people complain that academia doesn't communicate, right? There's always this, oh, but we need to hear more about, what academics actually are doing, and they never tell us, and their results don't transfer into, industry and into the society, and they're just working in their little, ivory tower. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. It's not true at all. When you look at what academics are doing, researchers in Hci and other disciplines, all the time when they do research, they're not done until they've published it. So they write papers that are there for the whole world to see. Many times even you have free and open access to these papers, right? You don't even need to pay for them. Sometimes there's publications like magazines or journals that you need to subscribe to be able to read the research. But that's not a major expense usually. And most of the research is free for everybody to see. And when people complain, oh, scientists should talk more to each other because they don't talk to each other at all, we don't see them hanging out together. We do hang out together. We communicate via the peer-reviewed publications process. This is what you're seeing right here. That is the living and breathing process of academic collaboration around the world. Like when Marcel does his, next study on how people create maker tutorials, he will be able to draw from a body of peer-reviewed, trusted knowledge from researchers around the world, no matter which country, state, religion, race, whatever they're from, who have all contributed to this body of knowledge that is openly shared. And that's what he puts his own research on top of, right? And he knows he can build on that foundation because it's not just any guy who's written something in a paper and put it on the web, but it's actually gone through that process of being reviewed by enough other people who have high ethical standards of making sure that the work that they review is reviewed fairly and that it is really without major flaws when they accept it for publication. That all makes it so that Marcel can step on that, on the shoulders of giants, as we say, right? Standing on the shoulders of giants to do his own work on top of that existing knowledge, right? So next time somebody comes around and says, academia doesn't talk to each other or to the world at large, tell them that they're wrong. They should just, take a look at all the publications we do write that contain our results, that are often open for anybody to read and take advantage of. Now, I've talked about papers so much, articles, research articles. We want to understand what makes a good paper. And you've already seen a little bit about that, right? We've talked about, for example, the contributions and benefits statement, where which is a nice way to, for you, it's a tool, right? For you to read a paper and look at it and try to draw out what is the key contribution and benefit of this work, right? But we want to see now, if you go to the, for example, ACM Digital Library, right? That's a common source for trusted peer-reviewed articles. And you type in, I don't know, maker documentation, right? To find papers that could be relevant for work, like what Marcel is doing. How do you judge whether a paper is actually good, right? You'll have to take a look at it, right? So a few things you can already tell. You can see maybe it got published at Sci, which means, okay, it's gone through a pretty rough peer review, and that's a tough process. So if it made that, then that probably means that it is pretty solid. Conferences like Sci and many others also give out awards to the very best papers that get published each year. There's an honorary mention award, for example, at Sci that is given to the top 5% of all submitted papers. So top 20% roughly gets accepted, but only the top 5% of all submissions gets an honorary mention award. And that's a pretty high distinction, right? That means that that work really does an exemplary job of going through the research process correctly and not overclaiming anything, and also having just really interesting and novel and important findings to report. That is, of course, kind of the key point of it, right? And then there's the Best Paper Award, which only goes to the top 1% of all papers that got submitted to a conference. So that's extremely rare, but occasionally, it happens. We've had a few of those over the years too, which I'm really proud of. But they mean that they are, the best of the best. When you read these papers, you can trust that they are doing the things that they do in a way that the whole community agrees on is the right way to conduct this kind of research. But if they don't have these, awards, or if you don't know the conference that you get it from, or even if you do know the conference, you still want to be able to look at each paper and see, is it good in all the aspects that are important to me? So let's look at these criteria. And this is, by the way, I'm not making these up, right? This is literally taken from the guide that the Sci conference puts out to authors, potential authors, where it tells them, this is how you write a successful submission for Sci, right? These are the tips we can give you, how you make sure that your paper has the best chances of getting accepted. So what makes a good paper is, first and foremost, of course, the contribution, right? You already know about the contribution. That's the question, like, what, after I read this paper, what do I know that I didn't know before? Right? That's the key question here that the contribution of a paper should address. And if you wrote a paper that shows, we showed that by using these differently shaped buttons in an application on a smartphone, on a touch screen of this size, then if somebody is left-handed, and then in this particular case, and they need to operate this eyes-free, we can show that they get 1% faster, right? You might say, even if the data really holds up and really shows that 1% difference, which is difficult to show statistically significantly, you might say, well, that is nice, but not a huge step forward, right? If on the other hand, somebody is able to show, wow, we've always thought that, keyboard shortcuts are the greatest thing ever, and I now can prove, in a valid study, I can show reliably that actually keyboard shortcuts are a terrible idea, because in the end, people are so much faster using the mouse for the following, wide, broad area of applications and tasks and contexts around the world. That's a big one, right? That's really interesting. So the contribution should be the step forward, right? A major insight that is really important for everybody, for the community. And it should bring that, of course, to the field, right? Not a new insight to physics, but we're interested in an insight to HCI if it's being sent to an HCI conference like Hci. Next up is the benefits, and that's sometimes hard to differentiate from the contribution, but hopefully you've already seen that difference when you go back to the contribution and benefits statement, right? The contribution is the new insight, and the benefit is, all right, what can I do with this? It's a little bit more of a pragmatic question, right? If I take this result, the new finding, what could other researchers or practitioners in the industry in HCI, or maybe even a broader field, what could they actually do with this? Right? What is there that I can apply this to? Next up, a criteria for a good paper is it actually new, right? I might tell people, wow, I found that, making pie menus, round menus, is actually so much faster under the following conditions, and I can prove it, reliably. Everybody would say, well, that's a great contribution. And I can also clearly see how we would use this in the community, right? It could go directly into a variety of applications and make usability better for these applications. But then somebody says, well, actually, there's this guy, Bill Buxton, who showed exactly this finding already in 1988. And here's the paper that shows it. So it's not new, right? It's correct, but it's just somebody overlooked an existing work that already showed the same finding. So that's, map, that's a fail. And how to avoid this? How do you, as an author, how to avoid falling into that trap? Well, you avoid that by looking at existing work, looking at prior work or related work, as we call it. That's why doing research is so much about reading. When I said earlier that Marcel gets to stand on the shoulders of giants, he can only stand on the shoulders of these giants if he actually finds those shoulders, right? He needs to find the related work that builds up this knowledge to the point where he can add something to it. Right? If he doesn't know about these other papers, he's going to stumble in the dark, and he's going to, spend his time doing research that he wouldn't have to do because somebody else has already done it, right? So we want to advance the field. We want to push it forward, and we can only really do that if we know what's already out there. And that's why it drives every HCI researcher nuts when they get papers that, where all the prior work that's covered goes back like 3 or maybe 5 years, right? That's a terrible mistake, because oftentimes there are fundamental questions in a paper that a paper tries to address that have already been addressed in work that is maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years old. HCI, I mean, computer science in general is a pretty new discipline, right? Computer science has only been around for what, like maybe since the 40s, 50s of the last century. And HCI really has only been a field of academic study roughly since the 80s, right? When really people started identifying this field as something to publish in. But that still means that we have now a, roughly speaking, 40-year catalog of work. And we're lucky, right? Because all that work is online, and you can search it in an instant on things like the ACM Digital Library. So it's really easy to get to. We don't need to worry that there is, a crucial HCI research paper that was written in 1750 and is sitting somewhere in the British Museum, right? So good for us, but it means that at least these 40 years, we should really take a good look at and find also older papers that are relevant results. Because otherwise, we're just going in circles. And in some areas, we're seeing this, that with every new technological invention, people are doing the same research again. I mean, I've seen researchers wasting their time on trying to understand how menus on web pages work when already menus had been studied to death on graphical user interfaces. And it's the same concept. And a lot of the work could have, informed these newer research projects. So that's completely unnecessary. Now, here's a tricky question for you. Let's say you are a reviewer of a Chci paper. How do you know that the work that an author is presenting is actually original? Okay.
I would first enter the key concepts in Google Scholar and see if there are any obvious results that show that this was already done.
Good.
And if I'm a researcher, maybe I already know other researchers that also conduct research in this field, and then I would look at them.
Yeah, very good. That's right. So you would basically do a little bit of the work that the original author did, right? If you were the perfect reviewer, you would do the full, literature search and, really try to make sure up to exhaustion that, there's no other paper out there that does this. But in the end, you can't prove it, right? Because you don't know whether you overlooked a paper that, actually does the same thing that the original author did. We can never prove the absence of that paper, just like we can never prove the absence of bugs, right? In software, we can only prove their existence or document their existence. So we can only do a reasonable effort to try to find out whether there is work already out there. And that's very much what you said, Paul. When I get a paper to review, it usually means that it gets sent to me because people know what I've been doing. And they assume, because I've been doing that research, that I know the field, right? The subfield of this. So let's say let's assume I've done lots of work in menu design. Then somebody will get a new paper, a new paper gets sent into Chci on menu design, and somebody who's among this distributing body will say, oh, we should send that paper to Jan. He's done menu design in the past, right? So paper will come to me as a reviewer, and I will look at it, and immediately, in my head, I know probably 20 papers that could be relevant to this. And what I will do is usually I will check, are those papers also covered in the related work section of that article, of that submission, right? So I will check whether the author of the paper has actually included other related work that I know of, whether they've also included that in their own list of related work, and whether they discuss it. And if I get a good sense that all that stuff is there, thank you, Paul, then I get a sense that, okay, these guys know what they're talking about, right? If on the other hand, they've overlooked one or more key papers that are in their same field, then that makes me nervous, right? As a reviewer, that means, oh, not sure whether they actually know what's out there, right? And so in the end, that's why as an author, when you write a paper, your related work section is super important, because it serves two purposes. Purpose one, you want to explain to the reader why what you are doing in your paper, in your research, is actually new. So if, let's assume you do work on pi menu versus linear menu, you have to show that this hasn't been done yet, right? And again, you can't show that perfectly, because we can't show the absence of research, but by showing all the other work that's out there and the closest competitors to your own work, right? And by comparing your own approach to these competitors, so to say, so the other research that's out there, you give the reader of that paper a view of the whole field, and they understand why your work is original, right? So it has these two purposes. It explains to the reader what else is out there, and oftentimes these related work sections and papers are great ways to catch up with the field. I sometimes read a paper just for the related work, and then I stop. I'm not even interested in the original work that the authors did, but I'm interested in these 15 other papers that they talk about, that they summarize for me nicely, because it gives me a quick way to understand a new field, right? And the second part is this, it shows the reviewer and the reader that the author has done their homework, right? That they have actually looked at the related work and that they are doing something new. So there are a couple of things that are important about this related work section, and they have to do with novelty. Next up, validity. We just talked about validity in the experimental sense. Generally, validity means I could say in my paper, I can prove consistently that, typing on a touchscreen is actually faster than typing on a real keyboard. Wow, this is groundbreaking. Everybody else thought it's different. It's not true. And the benefits will be huge, right? If this was true, because we could do away with physical keyboards. It would definitely be a new finding. I don't find this anywhere else. But the question is it actually true, right? Or am I backing this up by a shoddy study that actually, was heavily biased in the direction to give me the results that I wanted? Right? So that's the validity question. And then we have applicability. And that's a little bit more subtle, and it's not something that always comes up in the list of reviewer or of criteria, I should say. But what it refers to is the paper a good match for the audience at this conference in particular, right? When you send something, for example, to the WIST conference, UIST, it's a conference on user interface, software, and technology. So it's a pretty technical HCI conference. And now all the other things up there, contribution, benefit, novelty, validity, might be great, but it actually turns out that you wrote a paper that is much more about a qualitative study that gives us better understanding of the mental processes of users interacting with a particular technology, and not even a new device, but an existing device, right? Like Barry's paper on the trouble with GPS in the car, right? That would be a good example. That's not a good match for the WIST conference because it's not a technical contribution paper. The contribution type is different, right? So applicability has a bit to do, not only, but it has a bit to do with the contribution type of the paper, whether that is a good match for the audience at the conference that you are addressing. And then finally, there is presentation or format, and that is something that a lot of people overlook, but it's so crucial. And it's such a cheap win, right? It's so easy if you just put your mind to it to actually do a good job on this last part, that I have no understanding and very, very little understanding for people who don't do a good job on this. It's basically about, like, don't put typos into your paper that you submit. Make sure that it is consistent in how it's written. Make sure that your argument is laid out clearly, that you've had somebody else read it over, a friend who's not from your discipline maybe, and see whether they can make head or tails of it. It's about a clear, error-free presentation of your text, of your figures, of your graphs, etc., etc. So you could say it's user interface design of your paper, right? It's how you present your work to the reader, and that has not much to do with whether you are a good HCI researcher. It is about whether you are a good communicator. But I can tell you that most of the work in research, and not just HCI, most of the work in research is about reading other people's research and writing about your own research. A lot of it is about reading and writing. And so these skills are super important. So your technical writing skills, your orthography, again, just making sure that you don't make mistakes, right? In your writing, those are important things. There's lots of help you can get on these things these days. You can even use a pay service for having your paper proof read before you submit it, and that's probably the best $50 that you've ever spent in your career, if that increases your chances of acceptance. Why? Because if you send a paper to a reviewer and it is full of typing mistakes, and it's formatted ugly, and there's half sentences in there, even if I can still understand, as a reviewer, if I can still understand what you're saying, it just tells me that you don't really care as an author, right? It doesn't seem to be very important to you. So it communicates a sloppy sort of mind. And that is something that the reviewer will then be very nervous about whether you conducted your research properly, if you can't even be bothered to write it up properly, right? So the quality of your writing in your paper submission is like a business card you hand over to your reviewer, and you say, here's my work. I've really paid attention to doing this well. Now, please review the research, that is the basis of my write-up. And there's another thing, and that is just about, I'm going to get on a soapbox again here, but it's just about respect, right? Remember that what I said, the reviewing in an academic community happens by volunteers. It's people like you and me, like Marcel and I. We've done our share of reviewing other people's work for conferences like Hci and others. I do this every year. I read, like a dozen papers just for Hci each year, and these are also admissions. So only a few of these actually make it into publication, right? Now, so I'm volunteering my time and my brain here to do this, and I find it very disrespectful if somebody else thinks they could just use this resource without really trying to do a good job of writing up their research in the first place. If I already see 15 mistakes in the first paragraph that everybody could have fixed who has a rough grasp of the language, I don't feel that my volunteering time is really being respected here, because I'm being faced with a subpar presentation of some material. Why should I do their job? Right? That's the question that quickly comes up. So out of respect to the community that is all doing this on top of their normal workload, it should be a self-given thing that, of course, you format and you write your paper as well as you possibly can to not be a burden to other people beyond the burden you're already putting on the system by asking for a peer review. Sending a paper to a conference or to a journal always means that you're asking other people to volunteer their time to look at your work. So we should handle that appropriately and have respect for that. So I'm going to try something with you. And I hope this makes sense. I know that these different things, contributions and validity and so on, are pretty abstract terms. So I thought maybe we can take an actual paper that we wrote and that we published just a bunch of years ago, and we're going to look at it and see where these things manifest themselves, where we find these issues, like how the way I would look at a paper. We've already talked about how you read a good paper, right? Earlier on, that the idea is not typically that when you find 15 references in a paper that you would then go through and read each of these from beginning to end, right? That's not typically how you process academic literature. It's more a breadth first search, like you look at all of them and you look at the titles, the figures, the abstracts, maybe the summary, and you try to find the ones that are most relevant to you. And then if you find something that speaks to you that you think is important, then you dig more deeply. So let's look at, today we're going to look at a paper from beginning to end, just so that you understand to study the structure of it. Now,
Jan?
Yeah,
there was a question during the break by Paul, which I found quite interesting, and I would be curious about your insights. How long a paper peer review on average takes?
That's a good one. I would say if you do a good job, depends on expertise, but doing a good job probably means at least a working day, maybe two. If it can be much shorter, and that will depend on, whether, if for example, a field super well, right? If you've published in a field extensively and you are fully on top of all the latest research in it, and then a paper comes in on that topic, then you don't have to do as much searching on related work, right? if, for example, if a paper is actually pretty bad in the sense that it has an obvious flaw, or that it repeats a result that you know has been published before, like you look at it, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I've seen this before. It was, you know, Buxton 1988 or something. Then unfortunately for the authors, but fortunately for the reviewer, that's also a quick process, right? So then you can reject these, and you have to, and and you have to tell the authors what they need to do differently to have to do a better, you know, to write a better paper next time. If the tricky ones are the ones that are sort of, you know, really good, or that are maybe good but have some flaws, where you need to then dig more deeply, make sure that all the key aspects that we just talked about are fulfilled. So I've had some papers that I was able to review in, you know, just a few hours, and others would take me several days. It really depends, but it's quite a sizable chunk of time. And also, you're usually not done after your one review, because what typically happens is authors send in their papers, they get distributed to reviewers. Reviewer takes a look, writes a review. After they wrote the review, you would get into a discussion with your other reviewers on an online forum typically, and you would exchange opinions on it. And then ultimately there would be a, you know, everybody would put in their score, how they think the paper fared, and then ultimately there would be a decision made on reject or accept. And that goes back to the authors, and the authors then usually have a chance to respond to that, to explain maybe, oh, wait a minute, you read this wrong, we expressed this wrong, but our research is actually solid, but we just, you know, had this, we wrote this in a bad way so that it got misunderstood, so let us clarify here. And sometimes that can save a paper and actually make it get accepted. But of course, that means that the reviewers, after they've written their review, they have to read the response from the authors as well and factor that into their final verdict. So overall, it's a process that takes about a quarter of a year. CHI, for example, typically you have to send in your paper in September, and by January, you know whether you're really in or not. And then the conference happens in May. And these last few months are needed to prep for the conference, put together the program, sort everything into, you know, useful slots, put related papers together. Also to give the papers one final polish, right? Authors typically get a chance to remove any remaining typos, etc., in there before it actually gets, you know, burned into the PDF that gets uploaded to the digital library. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Paul.
There's another question from Sarah.
Yep, let's see here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have also a question. I was wondering, how do you become a researcher or a reviewer? Is it like you get added to the list when you also publish or try to publish a paper at that special conference, or is there sort of a database where you're always in?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I can tell you how it works for Hci. There's this two paths. One path is that you can register yourself with CTCHI and the Hci reviewing system as a volunteer, and then it's a little bit of a form that you fill out. You create an account there, and then you put your background in there, like what you've done and what kind of papers you've written, and what area you think you're a good reviewer for. And so it tends to be that in order to be eligible for reviewing at a conference, usually these people have published at least once at that conference in some capacity, maybe not as first author, but maybe, you know, they know the process, like they know what you have to go through. And of course, the more papers you've published, the more well-known you become in that field over the years. And so then ultimately people will just know you and will just send you invites to review automatically. They will say, oh, you know, this is another paper in hardware electronics prototyping. You know, I know Jan has done this floorboard stuff and done other things in this area, so I will ask him to review. But since the Hci community has been growing quite steadily over the years, there's actually been, reviewers are usually, it's a time-intensive job, because usually you don't review only one paper. You typically, if you volunteer as a reviewer, you're kind of typically review maybe 2 or 3 papers at least. You can kind of tell in this system how many you want to take, but it's so that you get a feel for the quality range, right? So that you don't just review one in isolation, but you see several ones. And so what happens is that especially senior researchers get invited a lot. Like, so it used to be that, Hiroshi Ishii, researchers MIT Media Lab, kind of invented the whole idea of tangible computing kind of in the 90s. And so for a long while, everybody who wrote a paper in this area would cite Hiroshi's work, and then reviewers would try to always send it to him. And of course, he couldn't review all the papers that were submitted in this field. So some people get overloaded because they're very high profile in a particular area, but then they only accept so many reviews. And so when you now write a paper and you submit a paper to CHI, you are actually asked, even as a first-time author, to at least enter your name in the volunteering list for CHI, so that you are in the system, so to say, for the conference committee to reach out to you if they need your help with reviewing. It is not super likely that you get invited as a reviewer as a budding student, because you don't have much of an academic track record yet. So other people may not know you or may not know what kind of work you do. But that likelihood goes up as you start publishing papers, as you go to conferences, as you meet your peers. Yeah, so that's how you end up doing that. That answer your question, or anything else?
Yeah, perfectly. Thanks.
Okay, cool. All right. So let's look at this walkthrough here. This is Force Ray, a paper that Christian Corsten wrote a couple of years ago as first author. And as you can see, Marcel was second author on this one, and I was on there as well, and Simon Völker, who's still at the CS department as a postdoctoral researcher. And so this paper was on a very simple idea. You can see it there in the figure 1, as we call it. When you have a phone in your hand and you want to reach a target that is high up there in the corner, for example, the button at the top left here, rather than re-gripping your phone to reach up there, which is, can make it fall down and stuff, and it's inconvenient, we thought we could provide an alternative input technique, which was you would actually push down with your thumb where it's convenient, and then a little ray appears, this little black line, and a dot on that ray appears, that little red dot. And then you can move your thumb, back and forth like so, to make the ray point towards the target that you're interested in, which is happening here. And then you start pushing down, and the force gets detected by the phone. For a long time, iPhones had, for example, a very detailed output on force input that people were exerting on the interface. And so we made use of that new input technique here. And so the idea was that the red dot would then start traveling up the line, and once it reaches the target, you have issued enough force to reach the target, and then you suddenly let go, which creates a sudden drop in force that you can see down here. And that means that you've selected that target. And so that was the input idea. But I don't want to talk too much about the technology here, because that was just the idea behind the paper. So where are all these things, contribution, benefit, etc.? Where are they all hiding here? Now, the first thing you see typically of a paper is the title, right? You see that even when you just do a search in the library. And a good title already contains a lot about the contribution, and maybe even the benefit, and maybe the novelty of it. So here we can see an example, right? So ForceRay is the name of the system that we invented. And we gave it the title Extending Thumb Reach via Force Input, which is a good description, right? We use force input to extend the reach of our thumb on a smartphone. So that's describing the kind of our contribution. And we say, why is this new? And maybe also in a way, what we could also say, this is sort of a benefit analysis here. So it wouldn't just be novelty, but maybe also benefit. we could say it stabilizes the device grip for mobile touch input, right? That's sort of what you get out of this. So by reading the title, if it's a well-written title, you should already be able to understand the type of contribution. A lot of papers in HCI that start with system name, colon, and then something long are typically artifact papers, right? They're artifact contributions. They have given their artifact a name, and that name is some kind of fantasy product name that they come up with, and that shows you that there's an artifact hiding in that paper. And then comes basically the list of authors, and to a certain degree, sometimes you may recognize the institution, and you may know, oh, this is a researcher from my field who's done some really excellent work in this lately. I'm going to pay extra attention to that. That shouldn't be, I mean, as a reviewer, you often don't know who the authors are to avoid any bias, right? You don't want every reviewer to say, oh, this paper is from Stanford University. They're so cool. I'm going to accept it and not read it, right? That shouldn't be happening. But once the papers are out and and readers start seeing that, for example, for 5 years, Lining Yao's lab at Carnegie Mellon University has been publishing work on shape-changing interfaces. If you see another paper from them, oh, this is probably going to be down, the research direction. So I'm going to take a look at it because I think the kind of work they do is going to be relevant to me because I'm interested in that field. So the institution, especially the university or whatever it is, may play into you understanding where this research belongs to, what kind of part of a lab this is. The thing is that another trick that is often useful is to look at maybe the last author in a paper or the last 1 or 2 authors, because that's usually where you find the names of the professors or faculty that run the lab. And that helps you often recognize research as part of a larger effort happening at the research labs. The PhD students change every few years. Those names change, and not all of them, very few of them actually stay in academia and become professors, obviously. But the lab heads usually stay the same for 10, 20, 30 years. So they start to become sort of the constant that you can recognize certain labs by. It's a typical policy that the lab heads are typically at the end of the towards the end of the publication. So in that sense, this one is a little bit of an unusual one because usually you would have had me at the end of this list, but in this case, we put Simon at the end. Next up, what people also often overlook is this figure 1, right? This graphic here is something, especially in papers in the HCI community, is very typical. And this paper tells you basically, this figure 1 tells you immediately what's going on, and it's usually carefully designed to communicate the main idea along with its caption, right? The caption typically explains what's going on. And like I said, we're not going to read through all of this, but I just want to say here we can see that the contribution gets laid out in a little bit more detail. Right? The force-way interaction technique addresses the reachability issue without destabilizing the device grip. So we immediately have contribution and also a bit of benefit maybe in here in this section. But for example, this does not talk about how this was evaluated, right? We don't know whether this was actually built yet, was it actually implemented, and was it actually tested with users? We don't know yet, right? We haven't seen anything about that aspect of validity yet in these parts. Well, then a paper typically continues with an abstract. An abstract is typically around 150 words, more or less. And it's the next thing you go to if a paper has managed to lure you in with the title and the figure 1. It's a quick read, and it typically is a super condensed summary of the whole paper, right? It should be. It should tell you very briefly what's the setting, the context of this research. Smartphone research. Then it should tell you what the problem is. Oh, smartphones have gotten really big and people can't reach everywhere without destabilizing, right? And then it should give you the contribution, right? It should tell you, oh, okay, so force-way actually lets users aim at, an out-of-reach target by applying force touch at a comfortable temp location, casting a virtual ray towards the target, right? So it repeats sometimes things that you might have seen already in the title and or figure 1, but the abstract has a little bit more space to explain it in a little bit more detail. And then we can see a little bit more detail about how it works. And then comes a section here about the validation, right? Which is, to address the questions of validity and novelty, right? So the study showed that it was faster than the best existing technique, bezel cursor. Interesting. By reading this, I already know that the authors actually took a look at existing techniques to solve the reachability issue of the thumb on large smartphones. And they compared to them, and they found that their technique performs in a certain better way, but differently than other techniques. So it tells me, they've done their work, they've read the related work, they will compare to the related work. So that's good to know. And then it also tells me a bit about the studies, right? And I compared bezel cursor and force wave with each other. Bezel cursor being another technique from another paper, whereas force wave is the technique presented in this paper. And a large part of this paper was about then in teasing apart how force wave performs sometimes in some aspects better, in some aspects worse than this bezel cursor technique that I'm not going to go into detail about. All right, so next up comes in a paper, and this is not necessarily now the order by which you read it, right? You would now maybe go through the paper, look for the graphs, the figures, read the captions, try to get a gist of what's going on, maybe read the conclusion to get another summary of the paper. And then at some point you would dig into more of the material here. But I'm going to present it now to you, going through page by page. After the abstract comes an introduction. That's always the standard layout in every Hci research paper that I've seen. The introduction, the idea of the introduction is it's a short path from the general field of Hci to our problem and our key contributions. So it has a bit of a summary. You don't need to be able to read this, don't worry about this. And we're just highlighting some examples here, right? It gives us a bit of an idea of where we are, what the problem is, what the contribution of this this work is, and how it is novel, like how it is different from existing work. We also get a little bit about a bit more about the benefits here. You can see here we have a highlighting here. Furthermore, it benefits natural ergonomic thumbs movement, right? So it talks about the ergonomic advantages of this technique. And then we also read just a little bit about the format here. Well, what this does is basically, this is a little bit of a format trick, right, that good papers do. They explain to you how the rest is laid out. It's almost like a table of contents. And in lots of good Hci papers, you will find this. This says here, in the remainder of this paper, we first review related work, before describing the design and implementation of ForceWay. To validate ForceWay, we present 2 user studies. Study 1 does this and this, and study 2 does this and this, and these are the results, blah, blah, blah. And we close with recommendations to address reachability issues for one-handed touchscreen use. So what you see here is that this is a well laid out paper. Well, it has to be, right? I was one of the authors, it's got to be awesome. But the paper gives us at the end of the introduction actually a little outlook over the rest of what's coming, right? And that's really helpful for the reader to know where they are. It also already summarizes some of the, it tells us that there will be a discussion of limitations, which is good to understand that, for the reader to know that that's going to be part of the discussion. Because a paper that doesn't talk about the potential shortcomings of its own work is questionable, right? Everything has its downsides, and we should be open about talking about them. Next up comes the related work section, and that's a huge one that will typically be laid out in under certain topics, right? It will address reachability and force input techniques, both on mobile devices, and discuss the related work successively, right? So here's a lot about other reachability techniques, other force input techniques. The reachability techniques are further subdivided into screen transforms and proxy regions and cursor techniques, right? And then here's a discussion of the related work and force input techniques. This is the area where you typically find most of the related work links to other papers. The actual list of papers you find, of course, as you know, at the very end, right, of the paper as an itemized list of references. But this is where most of these references are occurring in a typical research paper. All these numbers in parentheses here in square brackets are the references to related work. That's how ACM standard format does it. There are other ways of citing related work. As long as they're consistent and they're easy to understand and follow and find the related work, any format is okay. Usually, if you submit to a particular conference or journal, they will tell you how to do it. They will have a standard guide on how to do your references. Just with everything else, the layout, actually, the formatting, the fonts, and the size of fonts and the line width and all that is actually usually given to you when you write these papers as part of typically a template that you fill out. And LaTeX is mostly used in technical conferences, or sometimes you also get other templates like Word or something like that. Now, okay, so then we have section 2, the related work. Section 3 is then introducing the new interaction technique, forceway, right? That's clearly the contribution, right? This is going into much more detail about the key contribution of this work. And it does that then, and look at this, there's actually a sentence that says, forceway has 3 key benefits. Isn't that wonderful, right? Whether you're a viewer or reader of this paper, it tells you, here is where you will find out about the benefits of this work. I don't need to tease it out of the text. It's actually labeled for me nicely. So that's good, easy to read technical text. Once the technique is presented, the paper then continues on and starts talking about the studies that were conducted. And that's a big section. There is this desert of numbers in the middle of many Hci papers, Hci papers in general, that is about the studies, right? And writing about studies, how many users were picked, what their background is, how the study was designed, whether it was between groups, within groups, whether you did, Latin square counterbalancing, or how you avoided learning effects, what the task was that the people were given, what context they were in, whether in the lab or in the field, blah, 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 the demographics of your users. All that needs to be documented in a paper, but it's also not exciting to read, right? Unless you are really interested in a particular method. So you won't read this for many of the papers. Only if you find a paper that actually promises you a contribution and benefit and novelty that you are really interested in, then you will read this part to make sure for yourself, to confirm for yourself that the work is valid under your assumptions. Even if a paper got accepted, it may still not be applicable for you, because maybe it's a paper that promises you it has studied, this forceway input, and you are thinking about using forceway for, for an application for the elderly, to name something, right? And you may discover that they didn't study that population at all. So maybe the application in your area isn't as clearly valid as you initially thought. Or maybe they studied it only on a small, comparatively small smartphones, and you want to use this technique on a tablet, which is used typically in a different mode and with two-handed use and stuff. So you may have to go through this in order to understand whether the work is really something that you can build on directly, or what are the caveats, what are the limitations of this work when you try to apply it to your own context of your own work. So there's lots of stuff in here. Obviously, we have lots of stuff is going to be about validity, clearly in the study section, right? The novelty also, why it is compared to existing work. Here we're comparing it to mag stick and bezel cursor, and the one-handed mode. These are all other techniques that exist that we compared our work to. So we further document the novelty of our approach, that it is actually something different. And some things that you will notice here in the formatting, you can see that there are sub areas, right, that talk about the apparatus and the techniques and the tasks used in this. There are subheadings that are important, structuring of the text for the reader to make it easier to know where they are. We talk about the dependent variables here and the independent variables. Isn't that nice? As a reader, you immediately know where to find that information. And the captions to figures are super important because they often are the things that people read first. So we always try, when we write papers at our lab, we always try to make these captions really meaningful and not be, gobbledygook that you cannot understand without reading the whole rest of the paper. They're almost like a little, comic version of our paper, if you want, that could be almost read by itself to get a first idea of what's going on. so a good caption will always tell you, what am I looking at here? What is it that the graph is showing me there? And then what should I be seeing? Why are you showing me this graph? What is the message of the graph, right? That's a typical structure of a good caption. Well, and then this goes on. Here's the results section, right? So notice we've talked about the study, but now comes, what did we find? Like, what are the numbers we got out of this? And this is where a lot of the statistic goes. We'll talk about this more next week. But of course, this is going to be relevant to both the validity and also the contribution. And you can see here, for example, the layout is using a particular consistent color scheme for the graphs to make it easy to know which condition was which. So you can see here that the same technique always gets the same color. So these are small tweaks we do to our papers to make them really optimum at an optimum level of parsability, of readability. Right? And then we start talking about benefits, right? By showing, for example, how people had to reach across their device here in big ways with some techniques, and with how they had to do less thumb movement with our technique, right? So we're documenting the benefit here. And here's an interesting split you will find in all research papers that do this kind of experimental research. We just saw the results of the study, and those are undisputable. These are just the numbers, just the facts, no interpretation. And now comes a separate section that's often called the discussion or interpretation of results. And this is where the authors will start go in and try to make sense of what they saw, not just report the blank numbers, but actually try to make sense of what they saw and try to explain why these numbers came out, right? So the discussion is where more of the opinion and the interpretability of the data and more of a non-black and white is going on, whereas the number reporting and the results is typically undisputable if the experiment was set up properly. So you can see some, I just highlighted some formatting tricks we did here, again, with subheadings to make this more easily readable. But otherwise, then, this is, of course, about validity, but also the contribution and the benefit again. All right, and then what comes at the end after the discussion is typically a summary, a set of guidelines. In our case, this is not typical, but we did this. And this is, of course, also part of the contribution. We mentioned that actually early on, that one of the contributions of this paper is that we give guidelines to other researchers and practitioners based on what we found on how to design mobile touch interfaces that have force input, that we suggest to sometimes use the force rate technique, sometimes use other techniques, and when to make which choice. This is a very common kind of contribution to see in a paper. Now, we are at the 12-hour mark, so I would suggest we leave the discussion of the Hci review until next time, because that will still come up. Marcel, do you think we will be good doing that? I'm trying to line this up with the assignments that are going on.
Yeah, that's absolutely no problem. Yes.
That's not a problem, right? Yeah, okay. So then let me jump to what's going on next. So what you're going to see next is, first of all, the structure of a Hci review. We'll talk about how Hci reviews are done. And then once we're done with that, we will move on to a discussion of quantitative and qualitative analysis. That's going to be coming next week after the review discussion. And just a couple of reminders, you need to turn in your assignment number 4 until Wednesday morning. And the midterm is coming up. Aren't you excited? So 1st of June, midterm is coming up. We do this so that we have something where you can show that you're keeping up with the material, that you distribute your studying over the course of the semester rather than crunching everything at the end. So 3 weeks is not a long time. So start reviewing your lecture material now that you've already seen, go over it again and get yourself ready for the midterm. With that, we're at the end of today's class. Thank you very much for joining. And Marcel and I will stick around for a few more minutes if anybody has a one-on-one question. And otherwise, have fun in the rest of your week. Thank you.
Basically continuing what Professor Borges introduced, he basically showed you parts of a paper that are basically falling into the different criteria that we covered, like novelty, the contribution, or just the general format of the paper. And this is all in the context of submitting or publishing research in Hci. And then, of course, when you submit your research, as Professor Borges already also introduced, you are then receiving a review. And we will also look at the side of the reviewer today, so the people who are reviewing and providing this review, and a little bit of a structure for it and what is expected of people who do this review process. So with this, let's dive a little bit deeper into this and let's see whether. Yeah, so first of all, in a structure of a Hci review, you are expected to first of all provide a little proof of that you actually understood and read the paper correctly, because how else are you expected to provide good feedback if you didn't understand what the paper was about? So the first thing what is expected of you is to write a short summary of the contributions and benefits. So basically provide a contribution and benefit statement as we have showed you previously in the lecture, which then contains basically the general stuff like this paper presents whatever, and this paper also will benefit who with what. And then basically your review should be concerned with all the criteria that we already listed with that are basically criteria for a good paper. And some of these are, for example, the novelty, validity, and the format of the paper. And then basically an important thing, and this is something that is often the challenging part when writing a paper, is that you're not only suggested to criticize the paper. So not only listing basically, I didn't like this, this, and that, but you're also expected to help the paper or help the authors of the paper to improve on their mistakes or whatever you're criticizing. And then it is expected basically that you write in a way of, I personally think that the validity of the study is somehow threatened by this fact. However, I suggest that the authors look into, I don't know, introducing this method into their study to make sure that the validity is threatened less, stuff like this. Because basically the full review process not only has the goal of basically filtering out papers, that is actually kind of even a second goal, but also to making sure that the quality of the paper is high. And this does not only mean basically disregarding every paper that is not already at the standard, but also answering the question, can we bring the paper that we have in front of us up to a standard that is worthy of this conference? So can we help to elevate what we currently have here? Can we take this as basically, well, this is a great basis already. Can we build up on this and make it to a great paper? This is also a ground expectation that reviewers have, basically that reviewers need to provide in their review. And then afterwards, you are expected to provide a rating, which basically is a rating usually from 1 to 5. And this rating says that with a 1, you say that you recommend rejecting the paper because this does not really mean usually that you think the quality of the paper is low, but you think that at the current state, it's not at this point where it can be already published. This means, for example, that your suggestions for improving could be that they completely redo the study, which is something that is not feasible within the time frame between reviewing the paper and the actual publication at the conference. So this is usually that you say, I see a point where this paper is actually valid or beneficial for the research community, but I fear that the improvements that have to be made to get the paper to this point are not possible to be done within the time format. And this is basically then a reject, up to a 5, where you say strong accept. That means that basically with the current status or with minor improvement, you suggest that the paper has to be accepted. And to provide context to your review, basically you also have to provide a number for your own expertise. So saying whether you are a novice in the field, newcomer, or whether you're an already established expert. And this, for example, then puts more context to your review. This does not mean that your review is less valid if you are a novice to this. This just means that your view on top of the paper or your view onto the paper is different. A person who is a long expert in the field might look differently on it and see like, okay, you didn't cover this in your related work. But a novice might be familiar or more familiar with newer methods, and they will look into this and see whether there might be a new method that could improve whatever the paper is doing. So it's basically not an expert's value is always valued higher than a novice value. It's just the context of the review is differently. There's even the small internal thing that usually novice reviewers, which tend to be PhD students, usually have way more criticizing reviews than experts who are longer in the field, because they kind of have the tendency to feel that they need to prove themselves in their first reviews. And this is why usually their reviews are even way deeper than the experts' ones. And sometimes they also just have the time to look a little bit deeper into the paper. Cool. And then usually there's also a checklist provided. So a checklist that you can kind of go through that basically says, if you recommend the paper, so if you're recommending an accept, this is basically, again, a little bit on how you need to reconsider how this whole review process is looked at. Because it's not basically that you're kind of gatekeeper for it. So you're standing in front of the gate, every paper is standing in front of you, and you just say, you come through and you don't. It's more that if it's a reject, you need to strongly argue why you are rejecting this paper. But also if it's an accept, you need to do this. And basically, if you are suggesting an accept of the paper, you are becoming kind of this internal supporter of the paper. When you now need to convince the committee that afterwards filters the papers, basically that this paper is worth publishing at this conference. So you are now in the position that you need to argue for this paper. And then, first of all, you, of course, have to convince yourself that it has no serious defect. This is kind of the base standard that we're going for, so that there is no major thing that needs to be addressed in the paper. And then basically what I said, then you need to convince the editor that it is of an acceptable standard by explaining why it is original, valid, and clear in this case. And also, if you still suggest some minor changes, this is still possible. So sometimes there's a paper that has a really good finding, but I don't know, for example, the format is not there yet, then usually people are doing what's called shepherding. This is also a process that is currently introduced to Chci, where papers can basically shepherded to finishing, which means that they kind of get a supervisor or an advisor that helps them to get the paper to a point where it's actually publishable. And then, of course, you need to say where possible. So where is this possible? So indicating not just what to change, but what, let me read it again, indicating not just what to change, but what to change it to. Yes, of course. So basically, you're just not only saying this needs to happen, you're just also suggesting how it needs to happen and what the possible outcome should be. And then actually, again, you need to take reasonable care in checking the details. For example, you need to also, unfortunately, need to check the mathematics, the formulas, the bibliography, and just, again, have a full read of the paper and be actually absolutely sure that if you suggest to accept it, that is actually up to the standards of the conference. Okay. And then basically the checklist for reviewers if you recommend to reject. Then again, this does not mean that you're basically saying that the paper is of poor quality and should never be published. It's basically saying that currently it's not at the point where it's publishable, but you're suggesting now several improvements that the paper gets to the point, which then means that you need to clearly explain the faults and where possible, discuss how they could be rectified. Additionally, you need to indicate which parts of the work are of value and which should be discarded. So basically, again, going deeper into this, helping the authors to get to a good paper. And again, also check the paper to a reasonable level of detail. It is expected that you basically don't read the abstract and then basically already say, well, that's not a good paper. But it's expected that you, again, read the full paper, read every detail of the paper, also reconsider what the paper is writing. So are the claims true that they're making based on their data? So basically that Professor Borchers said that sometimes papers have this results sections where you have a neutral view of just the data that has been gathered or has been provided by the paper. And then you have a discussion section, which then is kind of an interpretation of the data. And then you, as a reviewer, need to look, is this interpretation correct? So is the connection between discussion and results actually feasible? And then additionally, the things that you always need to do is provide good references with which the author should be familiar. So for example, if you see that some papers are missing in their bibliography or the literature review, then you should provide them these papers. You need to ask yourself whether your comments are fair, specific, and polite. That's the thing. Again, you are helping the authors. You're not there to destroy them or to basically say, hey, your whole work of a whole year is shit. Usually everybody that submits a paper has put a lot of effort and a lot of work into their paper, and therefore it's only reasonable that you basically treat their work with the respect it deserves. And of course, usually things are never perfect. So there's always room for improvement, but it's up to you to formulate these improvements polite and respectfully. And then also be honest about your limitation as a referee of the paper. Are you even able to correctly review this paper? So for example, if there's a certain methodology that is used in the paper and you are absolutely not familiar with it, you can still review the format, for example, and the connection between results of the paper and the discussion part. But then you need to be honestly write in your paper, that you are not good with reviewing the certain methodology that they use because you're absolutely not familiar with it. So this is up to the other reviewers, or basically the main reviewer need to see whether they need to find a different reviewer for this, if this is actually so important to review the methodology, or an additional review. And then again, check your review carefully as you would check one of your own papers prior to submissions. So also you're expected to not have logical issues in your review, to look at your format. Again, it should be reasonable and it should be basically able to be well read and stuff like this. So also look into your own review and provide a good review that is actually beneficial for the reviewers, no matter whether you accept or reject, or whether you suggest accepting or rejecting the paper. Good. This was basically the checklist part, or the part that is expected of you as a reviewer. Next, I will show you a small example of an actual review of a paper, and then we can discuss this a little bit. Are there any questions about this so far? And then let's go into the example. So this is an example again of a review for the paper force rate that I think you also have read in one of the assignments, but no matter what, basically Professor Borchers also showed it to you in the previous section of this lecture. So I will just quickly read through it. I will basically read through the whole thing so that you are aware of what's in it. And then I will basically mark up the different sections and quickly talk about what these are. So it's basically, again, example of a Hci review of force rate. The target acquisition problem is a well-known problem on smartphones with larger displays. This paper proposes an alternative method that uses force input to extend thumb reach. Which results show the proposed method, FR, so force rate, does not outperform the previous technique, bezel cursor, BC, in speed and accuracy, but maintains a more stable grip while selecting. The paper is well written and clearly presents every part in detail. Relevant related works also have been cited. However, the most worrying part of this paper is the significance of the paper's contribution along with the paper's length. My first impression of this work through figure 1 was the proposed technique might not be easy to control via force input. Although 10, so this is a source usually, so this is a reference to, for example, a literature source, boy, which says then basically, also number 10 has shown a more reliable force input for the quick release technique. Force ray requires user to control the force and the direction at the same time, thus making the selection harder and less accurate. This concern has been confirmed in the results of the study. It might be a good try to combine a force trigger mechanism plus another targeting mechanism, such as extended thumb, which is basically a different technique. The biggest advantage of force ray over other techniques is the grip stability. However, the result of the subjective questionnaire, figure 8, reveals that there is no significant difference between bezel cursor and force ray. I would consider that the user's subjective feedbacks are more important than the sensor level rational data, because it means that the user has have no such feeling, even though the sensor data has differences. I was confused as to why the authors selected MaxStick as one of the techniques in study 1. Much previous work has already revealed MaxStick's disadvantages on large phones. Instead, extended thumb, source 26, and bezel space 50 are the better candidates to compare with, since they can be seen as different versions of bezel cursor and have never been compared before. There's a misleading description in lines 243 to 249. Corner space and bezel space are two different approaches, and the latter one provides the same benefits as force ray on scalability, efficiency, and visibility. In addition, the claim in lines 934 to 937 is improper because the experiments in both papers are not the same. It should be fairly compared, then the claim shall be made. Study 2 didn't reveal any new findings for this study 1, except the training effect, which is easy to predict. The authors can consider saving space to make the paper more condensed. Overall, the paper is well structured and easy to follow, but it lacks strong contribution along its page length. I would lean against accepting this submission at this point. And then there's basically a list of a minor typo on line 418. And please consider replacing source 26 with the following citation. And then there's a name of the paper that they suggest. That's it. So let's have a look at the different parts of it. So basically, I marked this up for you. So let's start with, first of all, the contribution and benefits. So I said that in the beginning that it expected that you basically begin your review with kind of proving that you have understood the paper correctly. And they do this by basically writing in the first sentence, the target acquisition problem is a well-known problem on smartphones with larger displays. The paper proposes an alternative method that uses force input to extend thumb reach results. Results show the proposed method, FR, does not outperform the previous technique, BC, in speed and accuracy, but maintains a more stable grip while selecting. So this is basically, as I said, close to a contribution and benefit statement, and just simply shows that the author of this review is aware of what the paper is actually about and is even aware of the benefits of the paper, so what it would bring. Then they start writing about the format. So the paper is well written, that's a comment, and clearly presents every part in detail. This is again, basically praising comment. Relevant related works also have been cited. So again, this starts then with basically providing arguments for their view on the paper. So they first of all, because that's also a pretty important thing. So it's basically not the decision I want to reject the paper and now I'm listing only negative points in my view of the paper, or I want to accept the paper and now I'm only listing positive points. First of all, you should provide an overview of all your thoughts on the paper, positive and negative. So it's basically, because this, no matter what, so even the positive things can mean for the reviewers, can mean for the authors, if the paper is rejected or even if it's accepted, because even with an accept, you have some possibilities to still improve on your paper up to the point where it's actually published. So for example, if they say, hey, this is well done, you can maybe improve even further on this or repeat this for a different section on the paper. So it is not only important to criticize a paper, but it's also important to basically praise a paper in a way. And then we have the novelty. So basically what makes the paper unique, whether that although 10 has shown a more reliable force input for the quick release technique, force ray requires users to control the force and the direction at the same time, thus making the selection harder and less accurate. This concern has been confirmed in the results of the study. So here they say basically what is good about the thing, but also what is problematic about the new technique, which is also again addressed in the paper. So the paper, as a good paper should be, is also criticizing their own technique in a way with, hey, this is good, but this is also still problematic in the current technique. And then basically everything in green is suggesting changes. I will only read this one section, not the other one. So it might be a good try to combine a force trigger mechanism plus another targeting mechanism such as extended thumb. So this is, for example, a new method. So they're saying, okay, you have these problems in your actual artifact in this case. So in your actual implementation, you might look into different possibilities to address these issues. And they say also the biggest advantage of force ray over other techniques is grip stability. So this basically means that you're not fiddling around or you don't have to regrip your phone while you are interacting with it. And then, however, the results of the subjective questionnaire reveals that there's no significant difference between bezel cursor and force ray, which means basically that although the data said that it's way more stable, users did not perceive it as way more stable. So it basically said it is way more stable, but users still were under the impression that there is no difference between the two. And this is basically why they are saying, okay, I would consider that the user subjective feedbacks are more important than the sensor level relational data, because it means that users have no such feeling, even though the sensor data has differences. Which again means that, hey, we are here in HCI, which basically contains the whole H, so the human part. And it's pretty cool that you made a technique which basically improved technically the stability, but people do not perceive it as more stable. So is this then even a good technique if users are not aware of that it's a better technique? And this is a point that is up to discussion, and they're basically putting their viewpoint out on this. And then again, for the validity, so is the study actually proven to be good? They are saying, so that's the purple part here. I was confused as to why they also selected MaxStick as one of the techniques in study 1. Much previous work has already revealed MaxStick's disadvantages on large phones. Instead, extended thumb and bezel space are the better candidates to compare with, since they can be seen as different versions of bezel cursors and have never been compared before. So just a question to you, is this addressing the internal or the external validity of the study?
I think it's the external validity because it doesn't criticize the study itself or the method or something, but the comparisons that were drawn based on that.
Okay. Since Kevin, you put your hand down, you think the same? Okay. Interesting. I was actually more on the train of its criticizing the internal validity. Then quickly let's think about it. So to get back to it, internal validity is basically that the results of the study are actually drawn from how the study is basically created, so that the independent variables actually influence the dependent variables, so that you can make this claim quite good. The external validity is the extent to which the results of the study are applicable to the generality outside of the study. So this means, for example, here, cool that all these things worked in your room where you basically put people on just a chair and gave them the phone, and there the whole thing was stable. But what is about if people are running around, bumping into people, getting into the bus and needing to, I don't know, exchange their bags on their arms? So I would say that it's more in regards to internal validity in this case, because it basically says, hey, you compared your technique to less optimal techniques than is possible and making the claim that you're outperforming these techniques. So, which is for me kind of this, you have your independent variable, which is kind of techniques that have been chosen, which are comparable to the new technique. And you have your external, you have your dependent variable, which is kind of, let's say, for example, user preference in this case, or stability or something like this. And yes, it's true that your selection might influence this, but maybe your claim based on this is incorrect because you have not compared it to the actual optimal ones. Because they're basically saying you compared it to something that's called MaxStick, and this has been proven to be actually faulty, and you're now making the claim that thus your technique is good in general because you compared it to less optimal techniques. And this is, by the way, this is an interpretation of me, what they're writing. They're not explicitly writing this here in the purple part. This is just what I understand from reading it. So please see it in this way. And basically they are saying, hey, there are better techniques that you can compare to and see whether your new technique still holds up to them, and therefore whether you claim that your technique is better than techniques that have been introduced so far is maybe not true. And therefore I would put it more into internal validity than external validity, because it's more like about the structure of the study itself, where they're saying, or where the authors of the study say that we compared it to all good techniques that are so far out there and we outperformed them. But the author of the review said, yeah, but there are better techniques. Do you also outperform those? So, which again is then, are your claims valid in this way? Okay, but I get the thought about external validity. Cool. And then basically they're just, again, in, let's say it's teal, I think that's what the color is called. They are writing that overall the paper is well structured and is easy to follow, but it lacks a strong contribution along its page length. I would lean against accepting the submission at this point. Cool. What is important for you to know, because there's something that you might not know, is that if you look up in the ACM digital library, you can see that the paper was actually published, and it also was published at this time of this review. So at the conference or at the same conference. What happens usually in conferences is after you receive the review, you have the possibility for something that is called a rebuttal. This means that you can basically address the concerns of the reviewers and also somehow are able to make some promises of how you would basically utilize the time until the actual publication of the paper to maybe address the issues that the authors, that the reviewers have. And therefore, then the reviewers, again, after reading your rebuttal, can say, yeah, okay, I believe you. That sounds reasonable. That sounds doable in the time that you are thinking on doing it. Or, yes, I understand your point now. I would say it's not that's much covered in the paper. So I would suggest you to put basically your arguments of your rebuttal into the paper, but I basically changed my view on whether the paper is to be accepted or not. And I recommend that now it gets accepted. Also, the reviewers can say, okay, I see all your points and I believe you that you might be, that you might do it, but I don't see that it's feasible within the time frame. So I stay with my basically claim of, or my suggestion of rejecting the paper. So in this case, it was the, so in this paper, it was the case that a rebuttal has been written, and afterwards the reviewer changed their view on the paper, and some of the concerns were addressed in the paper, and the paper was a bit restructured and then published. So this is again a look, or a deeper look into how the whole review process works.
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.